Hey, my name is Bentley, and I'm a physics student at the University of Manitoba. The science of vibrations appears all over physics, and it explains a lot of things that you deal with every day. We're going to be talking about how vibrations interact with each other in what seem to be the totally different examples of rocket engines and string instruments. Why do all the violins we're familiar with look and sound like this? But not like this. And why do these two different designs sound different anyways? They're both just violins, right? Well, not exactly. This instrument is actually called a rebec. It's the ancestor of the violin and was popularly played in Europe around the 11th to 16th centuries. Whereas the rebec has a distinct pear-shaped body, crescent-shaped sound holes, and only 3 strings, modern violins are shaped like a curved box with an indent in the middle, have F-shaped sound holes, and typically 4 strings. It seems that the features of the rebec were slowly morphed by tweaks and alternate designs produced by generations of instrument crafters into what we now recognize as the violin, but it's unclear exactly how this progression occurred. Popular intermediate designs included the Violin and the Lira di Braccio, which appear to show more violin-like features. Finally, our oldest clear record of a recognizable violin comes from a painting by Italian artist Gaudenzio Ferrari in his work Madonna of the Orange Tree. What I find interesting is that this painting was finished in the year 1530. The design found here was only slightly modified by lengthening and curving certain parts of the instrument, but otherwise is uncannily similar to the violins played today, nearly 500 years later. So, why did the instrument design just stop changing all of a sudden? Did the violin makers of the 1500s just hit the nail on the head with the perfect instrument design? What would make the design so good anyway?
My name is Colin Goff. I was a lecturer, professor at the University of Birmingham. I also play the violin, and I make violins on computers because that's a way of actually trying to understand how the violin works. Yes, well, a lot of the earlier instruments, or the very earlier instruments, were carved out of a solid bit of wood. But it was fairly quickly recognized that if you actually made the top plate of the instrument and the strings were vibrating on a bridge, and a curved bridge at that, when you wanted to make a sound on 4 strings, and also with a long neck that allowed you to change the length of the strings and the fingerboard, so that you could get over a very wide range of frequencies. That was the major changes, I think, in the development of the violin. The amazing thing is the form of the violin we know today really was developed by the Martis, the earlier Marti family members. And it's remained virtually unchanged because they got almost everything right from that very moment.
What would make this modern violin design so good for playing to audiences?
One of the things that is important is being able to make enough sound. The efficiency of a violin is actually very low in terms of converting your energy from the vibrating string into the sound. The choice of wood and the arching give you the strength, physical strength of the violin. The arching actually is very important too, because it changes the vibrational characteristics of the violin. And basically just getting things right. And that's exactly what Stradivarius did, and is being done today by many really fine violin makers.
Despite people having played the violin for hundreds of years, scientists are still just beginning to understand what really makes the instrument sound so rich and pleasant. Simple models that, for example, just consider the body of the violin to act as an amplifier for the sound coming from the string, can barely explain any of the features we hear when a note is played on a real instrument. Let's actually try to compare the sound of a violin with the sound generated just by a computer that plays the same note. With the violin, you can hear a complex and interesting tone, and the computer, on the other hand, just makes a buzzing noise that I don't really want to listen to anymore. Can we turn it off yet? Okay, now let's try another violin note to see if we can tell the difference again. Now, hold on, that's a bit weird sounding. Something must be wrong with that violin, right? Actually, this is a phenomenon called a wolf tone, where the note warbles instead of sounding steady, even though the player is using the same technique as always. And this is common to all instruments of the violin family to some degree. Now, you might start to wonder why we think this violin we have now is so great if the instrument still produces wolf tones. But the same process that produces them is intimately related with the one that gives the violin its rich sound. And surprisingly, we can understand the science behind this by taking a look at some pendulums. You're probably familiar with pendulums, but if I release one, it'll swing over to the other side and then come back again and then go to the other side again. We call a pendulum an oscillator because it completes these simple cycles of motion, going back and forth in consistent amounts of time. Now, here's a second pendulum that does the same thing as the first. When we attach them with this spring, they become coupled oscillators because they're now hooked up together. When one of these moves, it will push the other and impact its motion. What do you think will happen if I release the pendulums now? Will they both just oscillate again in the same pattern as before? Or maybe oscillate in a slightly different pattern? Or do you think they'll do something totally different that can't be described just as a back and forth pattern? Take a second to pause and think about it if you want to. Well, it turns out the first option was correct, because if I release them both from the same side of where they normally hang, they start swinging back and forth as if the other one wasn't even there. This happens because, as you can see, the spring is never stretched or compressed, and that's because the pendulums always maintain the same distance from each other. But wait a second, now if I try to release them from opposite sides of their natural hanging points, they don't swing together anymore. Instead of never stretching or compressing the spring, like we just saw, the pendulums are always pushing on each other through the spring. The neat thing is, though, this motion is still just an oscillation pattern because you can forget about the other pendulum and see that each one is just going back and forth in consistent time intervals. The frequency of this oscillation, or how often a full cycle is completed, is actually a tiny bit quicker when the pendulums are released opposite from each other compared to together, and this is because of the extra pushing force that the spring gives. So the second answer to my question about how these things move is right too, and that kind of makes sense. A system made up of two oscillating things can make two different oscillating patterns, or modes as they're sometimes called. But I've been a little bit sneaky because we've only looked at two particular ways of releasing the pendulums that each correspond to one of the oscillating modes. So let's try something different. When you release one pendulum and the other starts at its rest position, the motion is passed between the pendulums. One starts moving and then decreases the size of its movements, eventually to the point where it stops moving, while the size of the other's movements increases, and these odd cycles are repeated. We call this trading of motion a beating pattern. With these release angles, or any others that don't correspond to the two oscillating modes, the motion of each pendulum can actually just be described as a combination of the two oscillating patterns from before. When a pendulum here is swinging with its largest angle from the resting position, both of the two oscillation modes are lining up to tell it to go in the same direction at the same time. And when a pendulum briefly stops moving, the oscillation modes are telling it to go in opposite directions. Well, that's great, but how does it help us explain the sound of the violin and how wolf tones happen? How does the sound that we hear actually come out of the instrument?
The source of the sound, of course, is the vibrating string. Vibrations at those sorts of frequencies go through the bridge, and the bridge sits, in fact, on what we call an island area, and the sound then is transferred from that region into the upper and lower parts, that's top and bottom parts of the front plate, and that's connected to the back of the violin via the ribs, and that those vibrations of the plate are the ones that actually make the sound. So there's a chain right the way through from the bowed string to the vibrating plates making the sound. And in fact, even the air inside the violin makes a difference to sound. And that's one of the things that I've been using to actually as a way of characterizing violins.
So I'm wondering how a coupled oscillator model might help us understand the interactions between those parts as they all vibrate, like you were talking about.
I mean, The whole violin is a system of coupled oscillators. First of all, you've got the coupled oscillator of the string to the body resonances. And with coupled oscillators, if things are have two different frequencies, for example, like, of course, the apple on the end of a piece of string with a given length, as you bring those two frequencies together, they interact. And instead of remaining in the same frequency, they form what are called normal modes. So something goes backwards and forwards like this, moving in the same direction, or they can go in opposite directions. And so what you always observe in any measurements, in the sound that comes out of the violin, for example, or if you do a measurement of how it's vibrating, what you get is two resonances. Then there's the vibrations of any other thing that you put on the violin. For example, if you put a neck on the violin, that has a vibration. It wobbles up and down, and that can interact with the plates of the violin to give you a pair of coupled oscillators. So almost anything you think of on the violin can be understood and can only be understood in terms of coupled oscillators.
Here are some examples of vibrational modes in a violin. The color indicates how much each part is bending, and the circle represents airflow through the holes. So, could you describe what a wolf tone is?
Yeah, the wolf tone comes back exactly in that way, because if you have a string resonance that's vibrating at the same frequency as one of the body resonances, it couples together to form two resonances. When the coupling is strong enough, if you pluck a string at that frequency, you excite them both together. And so what you get is they interfere with each other, so you get what is called a warbling sound. So that happens on guitars, for example, when you pluck a string. But the same thing, in fact, happens in a slightly more complicated way when you bow a string. When you bow a string that's got these split frequencies and you're having to try and excite them both with a bowed string, you might still want to bow the string at that frequency where they overlap. And by forcing the string, the forcing of the string for most of the notes you play enables you to get it back under control. But on some instruments, when the coupling is too strong, you just cannot bow the string. And that's what's called a wolf note, because what you get is a raucous sort of sound, which really doesn't have much of a pitch at all. And often some of the greatest instruments, this happens, because the coupling needs to be strong, because you need strong enough, because you need to get lots of sound out of that sort of frequency. But you mustn't make it too strong. If it's too strong, you get this wolf note type effect.
That's interesting. It seems like there's a sort of balance between increasing the coupling so that you can get good sound quality, but then not increasing it strong enough so that wolf tones occur.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time. Maybe if anybody watching the video when it comes out wants to learn a little bit more about your works or what you do, where could they find them?
I've got a website at violinacoustics.net.
Thank you. The vibrations of strings and wooden plates can create beautiful sounds in instruments, but some types of vibrations are not as desirable. During the unofficial race to put a person on the moon between the Soviets and Americans in the 1960s, USSR engineers developed the massive N1 rocket, which miraculously failed 4 test launches, leading to the government shutting down the rocket's development and attempting to cover up the project. But it wasn't just the public that wasn't fully in the know about the N1 project. The cause of complete engine shutoff in the rocket's first test launch was poorly understood by the N1 team themselves for around 2 weeks after the incident, until it was finally determined that some type of structural vibrations had caused two gas pipes to rupture and start fires that eventually incapacitated the rocket by damaging the electrical system. In the 1950s and 60s, a key problem in aerospace research was figuring out how to stop these deadly vibrations, which were found to occur both in spacecraft and certain types of plane engines. And the best way to accomplish that was to determine what caused them in the first place.
We're here at the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada, and I'm here with Gilles. Gilles, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about what you do here?
Certainly. My name is Gilles Messier. I am the chief writer and soon-to-be curatorial manager here at the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada.
I was hoping to talk about combustion instabilities.
So combustion instabilities are something you run into in engines such as rocket engines and gas turbines, and it's an undesirable oscillation that occurs within the combustion chamber, and sometimes it's no more than an annoyance, sometimes it can cause significant amounts of damage, and if it really runs out of control it can literally rip an engine apart. And so it's very important very early in the design process for any sort of gas turbine or rocket engine to make sure that it can withstand small fluctuations and damp them out before they become dangerous. Combustion instability can be caused by all sorts of different things. So pogo is when you start getting oscillations along the length of the rocket, so hence like a pogo stick. But then those oscillations then cause the fuel to surge, which can cause oscillations in the thrust coming out of the engine, which feeds into the oscillation of the rocket, and the whole thing starts to extend and contract, and it can tear itself apart. And that famously occurred and almost caused the scrubbing of Apollo 13. Where they had an engine go out and it caused some severe pogo. And this actually was a problem that almost killed the Apollo program, because for the first stage of the Saturn V rocket, you had the Rocketdyne F1 engine. Very early in the design process, when they were test firing these things, they would explode. They would develop a combustion instability that would just blow the combustion chamber apart. And these are the only engines that were under development. These are the only engines they could use that had that much thrust in order to launch a rocket to the moon. So it took them about a year and $1 billion of trial and error to figure out how to stop this from happening. Even today, combustion instability is kind of a poorly understood phenomenon. Most engine designers will have their own in-house software, they'll have empirical models of how it works, but mostly it is trial and error. And in the case of Apollo, they came up with baffles just after the fuel oxidizer injector plate that they found damped out the instability before it could reach the rest of the chamber. And they tested this actually by putting little bombs inside the combustion chamber made of either gunpowder or high explosives to trigger an instability and see how long it took to damp out. And by the end, they had an engine that was so stable that even if you detonated a bomb inside of it, the instability would damp itself out within 0.1 seconds or less.
So you mentioned baffles as one way to combat a combustion instability.
Yes.
Are there any other prominent historical ways used to reduce these?
Yes, indeed. So it depends on what type of instability you're talking about. So this is the Avro Orenda 3. So this is one of the earliest jet engines that was developed and produced in Canada. As you can see, it has what are known as can combustors. So of course the combustor is where air and fuel are mixed and are burned, producing the hot high pressure gas that gets fed through the turbine and then out the rear of the engine to produce thrust. And in early engines, they had them separate. So these are the flame cans here. A couple of advantages to doing that. You can test each one of them individually, so it's a lot easier in terms of design process. The disadvantage is that it's heavy. It's not the most efficient system, but in the early days, it worked quite well. And so in relating to combustion instability, combustion instability is a problem in combustors for turbine engines. And one of the ways to stop combustion instability from starting in an engine is to not make it symmetrical. You don't place your fuel injectors symmetrically around the flame can, and you don't have all of them injecting the same amount of fuel at a time. That way you create a, say, heterogeneous system, and a wavefront can't really get started. And there's also different ways for solid rocket engines. So this right here is a Bristol Black Brant. This is one of a long family of sounding rockets, so research rockets that would be used to study, say, the northern lights, other atmospheric phenomena, astronomical phenomena for cheap that go straight up and down. These were invented in Manitoba, first premiered in the late 1950s. And these can also undergo combustion instability. It is a combustion process. It's in a long tube. It's a resonator. If you don't design the casing, if you don't design the grain correctly, you can get an oscillation that can tear the motor apart. I can adjust the geometry of the grain. You can add aluminum powder, like I said, which helps damp out some of the vibrations in the plume of exhaust coming out of it. Number of different ways.
Has there been much innovation in the solutions designed to combustion instabilities, or has that been pretty stagnant over the years?
Most of the innovation took place in the 50s and 60s because we had the Cold War, we had the space race where you wanted to create better and better missiles, you wanted to create rockets that could carry astronauts, space stations, lunar landers, things like that. It was a very competitive environment at the time, and then they basically figured out most of the major technologies, and now it's all about cost. Like, it's no longer governments pouring massive amounts of money. There are a bunch of established designs, there's proven techniques, and now we want to create something that works for as cheap as possible, because launching things into space is really, really expensive. So R&D takes a lot of time and effort and money, so you want to be using as much off-the-shelf hardware, as much proven hardware as possible. And in many cases, no need to reinvent the wheel. And that's just the economic reality of space right now.
Well, thank you, Gilles. Is there anything you want to shout out, or social media? Where can we find you?
Certainly. So I actually run my own YouTube channel called Our Own Devices, where I go to museums or private collections and I look at different types of vintage technology. I've done a few artifacts here at the museum already, and hopefully once I start working here full-time as curatorial manager, I'll be covering a lot more both for my channel and for the museums. So stay tuned for that.
It seems like there's a fairly rigid but effective system in place for dealing with combustion instabilities in the aerospace industry, because the methods developed in the mid-1900s still do the trick as long as you spend enough time trial and error testing them in your fancy new engines. But there's another industry using incredibly similar types of engines with lots of money floating around and where efficiency is crucial, creating the perfect environment for a focus on developing new solutions to old problems. It's the energy sector. In particular, gas-powered turbine engines are also used to spin generators that produce electricity in many parts of the world, and these suffer from combustion instabilities just like rockets or aircraft turbine engines. These used to use similar instability reduction techniques to aerospace engines, but they were found to only work for a limited range of operating conditions. A new method is being researched that has been shown to rapidly eliminate instabilities in the turbine engines and may be a large improvement upon existing technologies. You might be expecting some high-tech gadgets, but all this method relies on is a connection between two or more adjacent combustion regions in a turbine, called a crosstalk area because it lets the combustors talk to each other through sound waves. This area can come from a tube connecting two combustors, or an open region between them that naturally arises when they're organized in certain ways. It feels almost too easy. How is it that such seemingly trivial designs could work so well?
Now, hold on a second. Why are we back at the pendulums? I thought we recorded this part already. Well, it's true. We did use the pendulums already to explore the physics of coupled oscillators that help us explain violin sound. But it turns out there's also a connection between these pendulums and the strange effectiveness of a little tube in eliminating the combustion instabilities of turbine engines. There are two simple types of couplings that we might connect our pendulums with. The spring was an example of a coupling between the relative positions of pendulums, since the amount of force it pushes on each one with depends on how much it's stretched or compressed, which then depends on how far apart the pendulums are. Because the spring will push back on you with however much energy you use to compress it, we say the spring conserves energy and call this type of coupling coherent. Now, we could also couple our pendulums using this thing. Well, on one pendulum, we have a coil of wire, and the other, some magnets. When you slide them together or away from each other, an electromagnetic force is generated between them. That's like a velocity-dependent friction. Now, that may sound alien, but it's just the kind of force you feel when you hang your arm out of the car window, and it feels more resistance from the air when you drive faster. Unlike a spring, this velocity-dependent force doesn't store the energy you put into it. I mean, when you throw a ball into the wind and it gets slowed down, eventually dropping onto the ground, it doesn't jump back up and return to you. Since this velocity-dependent friction dissipates some of the energy of the pendulums, we call this type of coupling dissipative. Our friction-coupled pendulums can, again, move in two basic oscillation patterns and a mixed pattern. If I let each pendulum go from the same side, we see, like before, they act as if the other one wasn't even there. The spring didn't stretch in this mode because the pendulums had the same separation at all times, And the friction coupling is also doing nothing because the pendulums have the same speed at all times. Well, that was a bit boring. Does the friction coupling just do the same thing as the spring coupling? It looks like it so far. But let's try releasing the pendulums from opposite sides of each other. Now we have what looks like the same oscillation pattern as with the springs, but these oscillations are quickly dying out. This has to do with the type of coupling. The friction removes energy from the pendulums every time they scrape against each other. So this oscillation pattern that involves scraping quickly loses all of its energy and motion. This isn't the case with the spring coupling though, because the spring doesn't cause any energy loss. Now, any other motion of these pendulums will just be a combination of those two oscillating modes we saw. What do you think will happen when we release one pendulum and the other starts at its rest position? Is there going to be a beating pattern again or something else? The pendulums end up swinging together. We call this synchronization because the pendulums move in the same way at the same time. This ends up occurring for any other way you release the pendulums, and happens because, like with the spring coupling, the system is moving according to a combination of the two oscillating modes. But now, the opposite moving mode quickly dies out from the combination because it's losing energy to friction. So we're left with the system only moving according to the synchronized mode. Whereas coherent coupled systems create beating patterns because both of their swinging modes conserve energy, dissipative coupled systems create synchronization because one of their swinging patterns conserves energy while the other loses it, giving it a sort of preference to end up moving in the pattern that keeps energy.
Well, that's great, but how does this apply to the study of combustion instabilities in engines? A dissipative coupling model actually makes sense to talk about the effects of a crosstalk area, because when the instabilities are fluctuating opposite to each other, there's a pressure imbalance in the area. This forces gases to flow through the area, where they bump against each other and the area's walls, which causes energy from the oscillations to be lost in the form of heat. And when the instabilities are synchronized, the pressure on either side of the tube is the same, so no energy is lost to the coupling. But it doesn't seem like there'd be much practical use of synchronizing two combustion instabilities. Then we might just be able to make two rocket engines or electricity generators explode at the same time, which sounds cool, but would probably get you fired from your engineering job. Actually, what makes a dissipative coupling useful for this type of application is when you have two very different oscillators coupled together. A useful analogy that helps us understand this comes from these guys. Let's imagine that you have a set speed in your mind that you would like to walk at, and so do your dogs. If your ideal speeds are pretty close, you can use the leash to pull on your dog, which uses little amounts of energy over time, but helps you slow down your dog, or speed yourself up so you two can synchronize. However, if your ideal speeds are very different, the leash won't be strong enough for you to pull as hard as you need to get the dog to agree on an in-between speed. When this happens, to stop the leash from snapping, you can pull at the maximum strength it will allow, but you'll never be able to reach the compromised speed. So you and the dog will both just end up losing all your energy by pulling on each other and coming to a stop.
With pendulums, we consider our oscillators to be different if they have different frequencies when they swing on their own, and that depends on how long they are. So we have a pendulum with a weight near the top, which is like a smaller pendulum, and one with a weight near the bottom, like a longer pendulum. These clearly complete a different amount of cycles in the same time period. We say oscillators have a detuning when they move with different frequencies, just like how we would talk about musical instruments being out of tune. When the pendulums have a small detuning, even though they wouldn't line up on their own, the friction is able to hold them together in the mode where they're synchronized, at the cost of some energy being dissipated over time. Now, this is like walking a dog that has a similar speed to you. But if the pendulums have a large detuning, the friction isn't strong enough to pull them together and stay in that synchronized mode. So instead, there's a large energy loss and the oscillators come to a stop, like walking a dog with a very different ideal speed to you. We call this condition amplitude death because all the amplitude of the swinging has died out.
Now this sounds more like what we're looking for. A way to get rid of the oscillations would be great for dealing with the problem of combustion instabilities. And this is the main idea behind many of the studies into the crosstalk area. The dissipative coupling of combustion instabilities in adjacent combustors can cause amplitude death of the instabilities. as long as the combustors are detuned by having different properties like shape or size.
We've seen how great musical sounds and engine improvements can be explained by the same principles of coupled oscillators, but those also give us an understanding of how molecules absorb light and how to stop skyscrapers from toppling in the wind. The physics of vibrations tie together so many seemingly disparate systems, and nature is just waiting for us to uncover more of these fascinating connections.